He should have been crushed. That's what the numbers said. That's what most commanders would have assumed when they looked across the field and saw an enemy force far larger. An army that could stretch wider, feed fresh men into the fight, and wrap around the flanks like a closing net. But in 86 BC, at Queroneia, Lucius Cornelius Sulla did something that would define him for the rest of Roman history. He beat the larger army anyway. He didn't do it by luck, and he didn't do it by heroics alone. He did it by shaping the battlefield, by turning dirt into a weapon and forcing an army 4 times larger to fight, as if it were small. That sounds simple, until you understand how deadly it is. When a larger force cannot deploy its size, its advantage becomes congestion. Congestion becomes confusion. Confusion becomes collapse. And collapse becomes massacre. To see why Queroneia mattered, you have to see the world Sulla was fighting in. This was not the later Roman Empire. This was the Roman Republic under strain, a state that could still project terrifying power, but was politically unstable, increasingly dominated by ambitious commanders whose personal authority was beginning to rival the institutions meant to control them. Rome was developing the disease that would eventually kill the Republic generals using war to build personal power. Sulla was one of the most dangerous examples. He was operationally brilliant and ruthlessly practical, but he was also politically toxic, an ambitious commander who believed power was his right, and who would later prove willing to bend Rome's laws until they snapped. Queroneia is one of the battles where you can see both sides of him at once: the Roman general who saves Rome abroad, and the Roman general who learns from victory that he can do anything. The war he fought in Greece was part of the struggle against Mithridates of Pontus. Mithridates was no minor rebel king. He was a serious enemy with resources, armies, and the ability to inspire anti-Roman revolts across Greek cities. At a time when Rome's politics were poisoned and its attention divided, Mithridates' challenge threatened Rome's dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Sulla, in that moment, was Rome's sharpest weapon. But Sulla's battlefield problem at Queroneia was brutal. He was operating far from Italy, in an environment where supply lines were fragile and local politics mattered. He was facing a coalition force linked to Mithridates, larger, more confident, and capable of trying to overwhelm him by sheer mass. When an enemy has far more men, the first danger is encirclement. The second danger is fatigue. The third danger is psychology. A bigger army can keep pushing while a smaller force tires. A bigger army can replace its front line. A bigger army can overwhelm the mind of the smaller force simply by existing as a wall of bodies. If Sulla fought on open ground, he could be surrounded and slowly crushed. He understood this, and because he understood it, he didn't begin the battle with swords. He began it with preparation. A battle like this is won before it begins. You choose terrain that limits flanking, create obstacles that deny mobility, force the enemy to attack through constrained lanes, and build a situation where your smaller force never has to face the enemy's full size at one time. That means digging. It means trenches and barriers. It means shaping approach routes so the enemy cannot spread wide and swallow you. This is why Sulla's style is frightening. He didn't treat war as spectacle. He treated it as control. If the enemy's advantage is numbers, you remove their ability to use numbers. If the enemy's advantage is mobility, you slow them. If their advantage is morale, you shock them with discipline. Queroneia's landscape offered ridges, valleys, and constraints that a clever commander could use like tools. Sulla used those constraints and enhanced them with engineering. Meanwhile, the enemy, larger and more confident, believed size would decide the day. A coalition with numbers often assumes pressure alone will break the smaller force. It expects retreat. It expects panic. It expects collapse. But Sulla's legionaries were trained to endure pressure. They were trained to hold formation when fear says run. They were trained to win by not breaking. And now the stage was set for the key question: how does a smaller force convert defense into destruction? Holding alone is not victory. The larger army can keep trying. Eventually, fatigue creates gaps. So Sulla needed not only to survive the first wave, but to create the moment where the larger force lost cohesion, and then exploit that loss until retreat became rout. That is where massacres happen, not in equal fighting, but in collapse. When a larger force breaks, while compressed by terrain and obstacles, it can die faster than anyone expects. In the next part, we'll move from context to mechanics, how Sulla denied flanking, how trenches and terrain turned cavalry and mass into problems, and how the battle's sequence, pressure, endurance, turning move, transformed, 4 times larger, into one of Rome's most brutal victories in Greece. If you want the simplest explanation for how Sulla beat an army 4 times larger, it isn't a speech. It's this: he refused to fight the enemy's battle. A larger force wants open space. Open space allows it to spread, surround, rotate fresh troops to the front, and keep pressure constant until the smaller force cracks. Numbers only matter when they can be applied across the line, so Sulla attacked the one thing the larger force needed most room. Queroneia was a battlefield where terrain could become a cage. It had ridges, slopes, and choke points. Sulla chose a position that protected his flanks naturally and forced the enemy into a narrow and predictable front. If the enemy cannot spread, the enemy cannot use its numbers fully. If the enemy cannot use its numbers fully, the battle stops being 4-1. It becomes closer to equal at the point of contact. But terrain alone is not enough, so Sulla dug. Trenches are geometry. They block movement, break charges, funnel attackers, and buy time. They solve the biggest danger of fighting a larger army: flank collapse. Trenches and obstacles make flanking harder, slower, and riskier. They also create predictable lanes. Predictable lanes allow you to plan where and when to strike. If you know the enemy must come through certain spaces, you can reinforce those spaces, hold reserves behind them, and prepare counterattacks that hit when the enemy is compressed. Compression is the enemy of big armies. When too many men press into limited space, strength becomes congestion. They cannot maneuver, cannot rotate tired troops, cannot swing weapons effectively. Their front line becomes trapped between the Roman wall and the crowd behind it. Their own mass begins to crush their discipline. The battle begins with probing and pressure. The larger army tests Sulla's line, searches for weakness, tries to find where cavalry or mobile units can turn the flanks. But trenches, terrain, and Roman cohesion reduce options. The enemy is forced into direct pressure. Direct pressure against Roman heavy infantry is exactly what Rome is built to endure. So Sulla's line holds. But holding is survival, not victory. Sulla needs a turning point. Prepared ground makes turning points more lethal because it creates congestion. If you strike into congestion, the enemy cannot step away. When the enemy cannot step away, panic spreads. Meanwhile, cavalry, terrifying on open ground, becomes less decisive in broken terrain and near trenches. Cavalry needs speed and room. Obstacles remove speed. Without speed, cavalry cannot break disciplined infantry. So Sulla's preparation neutralizes dangerous tools and forces the enemy into the kind of fight that favors Roman cohesion. As attacks fail repeatedly, morale cracks. First in pockets, then wider. A battle doesn't need to kill everyone to destroy an army. It only needs to break belief. Once belief breaks, retreat begins. Once retreat begins on constrained ground, retreat turns into rout. And routs are where massacres happen. In the next part, we'll walk through that collapse, how one sector broke, why the larger force became a crowd, and how Sulla turned organized pressure into annihilation, winning Greece for Rome and feeding the ruthless confidence that would soon be turned back toward Rome itself. Once a battle reaches the point where one side begins to lose shape, the end can come suddenly. Before that moment, armies look like machines. They have lines, flags, commanders, and rhythm. But once the system breaks, once formations stop obeying commands, the army stops being an army and becomes a crowd. And crowds collapse. This is the mechanism behind what later writers call massacres. The killing becomes concentrated after the decision is already made, not because the victors become suddenly stronger, but because the defeated become suddenly helpless. Queroneia is exactly that kind of battle. Sulla forced the larger force to fight inside constraints. Terrain, trenches, funneled approaches, until pressure and frustration created disorder. Once disorder appeared, he turned it into irreversible collapse. A larger army attacks in waves, expecting to grind the smaller force down. But when space is denied, the waves clog. Units can't rotate. Officers can't control pace. The front line chokes under its own weight. At first, congestion feels like strength, but it's fragile. A congested mass cannot maneuver. It cannot step aside. It cannot recover if pushed back. It cannot remain calm when something goes wrong. All it takes is one failed push. The front line begins to stumble or retreat. In open ground, retreat can be absorbed and reformed. In constrained ground, retreat becomes collision. The front tries to move back while the rear still pushes forward. They crash. The line becomes uneven. Gaps open. Gaps create exposure. Exposure breaks morale. Roman discipline now becomes lethal. Roman legionaries maintain spacing and rhythm. They do not chase individuals. They recognize the turning moment. The second the enemy's cohesion is failing. Sulla needed only one critical sector to break. Once one sector breaks, panic spreads sideways. Neighboring units feel flanked and surrounded. They turn their heads, stop facing forward, and the wall becomes a broken chain. Retreat begins in pockets. Another pocket sees it and assumes collapse. In a crowded space, fear is contagious. The army becomes a crowd. And once the crowd runs, the slaughter begins. The crowd throws away shields, abandons heavy equipment, and tries to escape through constrained lanes. Trenches become traps. Men stumble. Bottlenecks form. Pursuit becomes devastating. Prepared ground becomes deadly not only in attack but in retreat. This is why Sulla's dirt mattered so much. It shaped the end. A smaller disciplined force can pursue in organized groups, cut routes, trap clusters, and convert retreat into annihilation. The victors remain a machine. The defeated become a stream of panic inside a cage. The consequences are immediate. A victory like this breaks enemy confidence across Greece. It tells cities thinking of rebellion that Roman discipline can destroy larger armies if fought on the wrong ground. It pressures Mithridates' network and makes allies cautious. But it also does something darker. It teaches Sulla that he can bend outcomes through control, that he can win against impossible odds, that he can force history to obey him. That confidence will soon be applied not only abroad, but at home. In the next part, we lock the meaning, how Queroneia reshaped the war against Mithridates, how it secured Greece, and why it is remembered not only as a masterpiece of tactics, but as a warning, because the same ruthless genius that saved Rome's influence abroad helped poison the Republic's future. After Queroneia, the battlefield went quiet, but the consequences did not. The immediate result was clear. Sulla shattered a larger enemy force in Greece and restored Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Cities that were wavering now had to reconsider. Neutral elites became cautious. Networks built around anti-Roman confidence began to crack. In wars of influence, a victory like this is a political earthquake. Queroneia didn't just defeat soldiers, it defeated belief. Belief is what buys alliances, supplies, and loyalty. Once belief shifts, cities behave differently. They hesitate before rebelling. They hedge. They negotiate. They open gates. A battle can change politics faster than any treaty. For Rome's campaign against Mithridates, this mattered because the struggle wasn't just military. It was about whether the Greek world would remain under Roman domination or pivot toward an Eastern king who promised liberation? Queroneia answered that question with violence and certainty. Rome could still enforce its will, but Sulla's victory also strengthened his personal power. It gave him prestige and an army that believed in him. That combination, prestige plus loyal veterans, is exactly what the Roman Republic was increasingly unable to control. Late Republican warfare produced domestic monsters, generals who returned with money, reputation, and soldiers loyal to them personally rather than to the Senate. Sulla understood how to use that loyalty. Every victory reinforced the lesson that institutions were weaker than armies. The same ruthlessness that made him effective abroad would soon be directed inward. That is why Queroneia is both a masterpiece and a warning. Strategically, the victory shifted momentum. Momentum allows a commander to choose where the next fight happens. Before Queroneia, Sulla had to survive outnumbered. After it, the enemy was forced to react, regroup, and avoid direct confrontation. That gave Sulla freedom to press the campaign, secure key points, negotiate from strength. The Eastern resistance became slower and more defensive. But there is also a moral and human cost. Queroneia reinforced Roman imperial domination in Greece. It told the region that rebellion would be punished brutally. It reminded cities that Rome's command was not a suggestion. It was an order backed by disciplined violence. Sulla's brutality is part of his effectiveness, and it is also part of why he becomes a warning. Because the same mind that turns trenches into victory can turn laws into obstacles. The Republic's tragedy is that it needed men like Sulla to win abroad, and men like Sulla made it harder for the Republic to survive at home. So Queroneia can be read in two ways at once: as a military masterpiece of terrain, preparation, discipline, and turning pressure into rout, and as a step toward Rome's internal crisis. Because Sulla's victories abroad fed the confidence and loyalty that would soon destabilize the Republic itself. If you want the final image, don't picture only the battlefield. Picture Sulla after victory, surrounded by veterans who trust him completely, in a land that now fears him. In that moment, you can see the future forming. A commander who wins impossible battles begins to believe he is allowed to decide what Rome is. And when that belief enters Roman politics, the Republic's balance becomes fragile. Queroneia proved Sulla's genius. It also proved the danger of that genius.